Hello, everyone. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the intelligent social media platform. Go download it for your iPhone and Android devices or sign up at noetic.app. The following conversation is with my mentor, Charlie Wilkinson, about Borges' The Fearful Sphere of Pascal. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. So, Charlie, you were talking to me about Borges being a bit of a Joker figure that perhaps that reminded you of the Jokers in Shakespeare.
He did, in that their jobs, they had to be a step ahead of and a step smarter than everyone else. Their job was to keep people amused, entertained, still speak deep truth, and not get their heads chopped off, if that kind of makes sense. And as I was thinking about this particular essay on the fearful sphere of Pascal, I think about whether or not, when we are with Borges, are we talking about something, which is Borges' essay, or are we talking about something, which is Borges' labeling of Pascal's comment as metaphor? And the notion of metaphor strikes me as being central to this entire conversation. A metaphor being a thing that stands as a symbol for something else, and it being at once the vehicle for Pascal's expression. You ask, do we think that Pascal means that the universe, or that God, or whatever, and we can talk about translations later, do you think that he means it literally? And Borges' ultimate labyrinth, the idea that language is inherently inadequate by virtue of its being a stream of approximations, and that the observer is inherently inadequate by virtue of their limited and biased experience.
Uh, I think the obvious answer is yes. No.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, there are so many parts to the question that you just asked there. I'm going to have to bracket that and take it like piece by piece.
Sure.
And, we didn't have any sort of conversation about how we would go about addressing this piece, the fearful sphere of
No,
Pascal.
we don't have any groundwork. Yeah.
No, and I wonder if we should. In the past, I've done with shorter pieces. I've had we've taken it line by line or paragraph by paragraph, but perhaps it should be a little bit more free form. Just as an introduction, I mean, let's see if I can get this right. For those who are unfamiliar with the text, I mean, essentially what we're talking about in the fearful sphere of Pascal is that, and Charlie, correct me if I oversimplify it, which I know I'm going to do. I've been deep in another piece of Borges's In Memoriam JFK 1965. I've been writing that up. So a lot of similar themes are addressed there, dealing with infinity and whatnot. But essentially, I think what he's doing is he's tracing the origination of the idea of God being this perfect infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere, and that this largely comes from a Greek, a Hermetic tradition that gets kind of picked up in the Renaissance by physicists and astrologers, and essentially we get the God becomes synonymous with the universe, and the universe itself becomes a sphere with this ever expanding boundary and the center that's everywhere. And the Pascal Borges says in this particular translation of Turner's, I believe, that he originally was going to call it as he's contemplating the cosmology, Pascal is saying initially that he was going to call it the fearful sphere. And he then changes it at the last moment to infinite. There's a strike through. And I guess Borges wants to bring our attention to the existential ennui that we feel about being in an unbookended universe where there are no boundaries, where there is no time that matters, there's no space that matters, because essentially the center is everywhere and there is really no chronology because everything's infinitely expanding. And I think what's fascinating about what Borges has done here, and effectively done in a matter of 2 pages or so, is shown how this metaphor of the sphere has transmigrated down the line and has been handed down to our modern conceptions of the universe. And I think it's kind of brilliant how he so effectively does that. That's why I enjoyed this piece. And personally, I think what I get out of Borges and why I love him so much, even though I'm kind of a neophyte, is that he is encyclopedic with his references. And personally, I like all the little Easter eggs that he buries in there, dropping names like Bruno, dropping names like Capanella. These are names that the average person has no idea about and how much they have shaped their understanding of reality. And that's what I appreciate about Borges. So I wanted to get that out of the way. Now, have I oversimplified the general arc of what Borges is trying to do with
Not at
Pascal's
all.
Fearful Sphere?
I think you have nailed the text, but I'm not sure that I'm not sure that our conversation is about the text as much as it
Sure.
might be, or balanced by a conversation about his intention.
Sure, let's have it.
Well,
Yeah, we can take it
I
there.
don't know that I can have that conversation. I just feel that when I read Borges, even when I'm reading translations, I read a person who has measured every word that he has chosen to use.
Yes.
Every
Yes.
word is a judgment, and every word is very, very carefully designed, as you were saying, as an Easter egg, and reveals different things depending, as you haven't mentioned the article or the short story yet, but what was it, the Garden of Endless Paths,
Forking paths.
that things just swirl around, even when he is writing a history. Something as little for me as his first sentence, "It may be." Think about how he's given himself some wiggle room. It may be that universal history is the history of a handful of metaphors. And then his last sentence is, "It may be that universal history is the history of the different intonations given a handful of metaphors." And so he's taken his original sentence and then given us, I believe, an expanding, and I don't know if we'd call it geometrically spherical, interpretation of that sentence.
What's interesting, and to be honest, I think if we were to talk about metaphor, we could talk about how the piece begins and how the piece ends, because those two sentences are pregnant with so much meaning, like you pointed out.
Absolutely.
And I would be content to do that, and we wouldn't have to go into all the Easter eggs. I can save that for my writing. That way, it can make people desire to get my book eventually one day.
But the other thing is that there are beautiful distinctions that he guides us through along the way. When we talk about the subject of this metaphor, is it infinity? Is it God? Is it nature? What is this thing? And he leads me to think about different possible expressions, and leads me toward the inadequacy of metaphor and the inadequacy of something that is at all short of paradox. And I love the fact that there is also paradox at the center of this essay. Does that make any sense?
Well,
to you?
there has to be, right? Because ultimately we are beings that are, if you're going to take a reductionist sort of view, maybe not. I mean, ultimately we're existing in three-dimensional space-time or something like that, right? And ultimately he's trying to get outside of that with language to describe you start take like a godlike perspective to describe what God in the universe and infinity may be, which is by its very nature, kind of a violation of the beings that we are.
And it's also doomed to failure.
Well, that's okay. I'm a bit.
Yes.
Failure is amazing.
Yes.
The best lessons I've learned in my life have been through failure, not through success. And I wanted to point out, as we were talking about, it just occurred to me. We talked, because I hadn't thought too much about the angle that you wanted to approach this conversation with, or how you led off with, but the fact that it begins and ends similarly, but differently. We kind of have a universe bookended here.
Yes.
So as much as he's talking about all the expansion of a sphere whose center is everywhere and the circumference is nowhere, he has provided all of that information within something that is purposefully bookended. So there's an irony and a paradox there.
Amen.
That that's just now occurring to me. Had you noticed that before? I'm sure you did.
Well,
I'm sure that's why you even brought it up.
Well, that turned me back to reading more about Borges, to approaching this as something other than just a toss-off essay about the history of this this clever thing that Pascal said. There's bigger game afoot whenever he puts his pen to paper.
Well, maybe let's talk about this first two sentences in relation to how you brought up the metaphor issue. The first two sentences are: it may be that universal history is the history of a handful of metaphors. The purpose of this note will be to sketch a chapter of this history. Now, you zoned in on the "it may be." And now the thing that caught my attention in that first sentence was universal history.
Yes.
I had all these questions about, and you saw that from my Google Doc probably,
Yes.
but I have all these questions about what is universal history. Is universal history, like, are we talking literally about the history of the universe and our conception of it? Are we talking about ultimate reality? If we're talking about ultimate reality, I mean, this ultimate reality is ultimately coming from mystery schools and the Greeks and Renaissance occultists and whatnot. That is a remarkably narrow universal history, because we have all these other traditions that understand cosmology differently and understand God differently.
I wonder. I'm sorry. Please continue.
Yeah. But then there's like another option too, that if this is a universal history, if that this is imprinted on every human mind, and kind of in a Jungian way, the unconscious is it unconscious is working, has this metaphor implanted within it in order to schematize the entire world naturally. And this occurs amongst people, regardless if they're in Greece or Italy or Oxford or MIT, You
get closer to my reading of that sentence in your last description. And that is, for me anyway, universal history being, and I refer back to something else that he described as the cartographers attempting to create the perfect map, and ultimately simply replicating the land that they were mapping to the point that it was useless, so that universal history might well be everything, and that mapping universal history must necessarily be done metaphorically. No understanding that we're going to be slicing off some edges here. We're going to be rounding things off so that they're manageable, because otherwise we're carrying the whole thing around with us.
Right. And this is a fantastic point. I just want to mention to individuals that may not understand what Charlie is referencing, the whole reason why I got into Borges is that I just finished, not about a month ago, Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation, and he begins Simulacra and Simulation with a Borges with a paraphrase of a Borges piece called "The Exactitude of Science." Did you know this?
That's what I read. That's what I read. Took this little bit from. Yes.
And what ultimately trained my attention to Baudrillard and the Simulacra and Simulation is that it's one of the books that's actually flashed in the Matrix movie.
Really?
Neo has a hollow. Neo has a hollowed out copy of Simulacra and Simulation, and within it he has like pirated software and money, and you see it briefly. And my experiences with movies is that directors plant certain books in movies saying, hey, nudge, nudge, for whatever reason, please look at this. Like, another movie I'm really interested in is a Donnie Darko. And in that movie, they include a Graham Greene story called The Destructors and Watership Down and a couple other things. So I picked up this, I learned it from watching a lot of Stanley Kubrick movies. Like when they flash a book, it's like, hey, go read this because it'll help you understand what I'm trying to communicate here.
Right.
But getting back to this, the exactitude of science, the map metaphor and the cartography is ultimately Borges got that from Lewis Carroll, because Lewis Carroll wrote a book called Sylvia and Bruno Concluded, where the same concept is mentioned, where they make a map so big that ultimately it ends up covering the whole country. And Umberto Eco talks about this as well in an essay called The Impossibility of Building a Map, I don't remember the rest of it. So all these writers are tapping into that. But I think what you're saying is super important, that whenever we try to create through metaphor a cartography of God, the infinite, the universe, we have, in order to make it manageable, because it can't possibly contain the entire thing, we have to round off the edges. And it's interesting that we're talking about a sphere that has no edges. And in order to even get our minds around it, otherwise, it would be this monstrosity that would be suffocating and oppressive and would make life impossible to live. Now, I don't know if that's true. I tend to be a detail guy, but it's interesting to think about metaphors as maps. I hadn't really thought about it like that, but I think in a way they are. In a way, they're maps of our imagination that we apply to the reality.
Yes, given if you will accept that they are imperfect and inherently imperfect, that they will limit the available dimensions for discourse in the choices that were made. For example, a sphere. The notion of a sphere, whether or not it is I'm trying to find it right now. Whether or not it is a sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere, and whether or not it is an intelligible sphere. That part knocks me out too. An intelligible sphere that has a center everywhere and a circumference nowhere. Try to do that for a minute.
Well, I've spent probably about 5 years doing that, and I could and it's, to me, it is unintelligible. Okay. Fortunately, through these different Easter eggs that Borges has put in here, in a sense, he mentions that Aristotle thought it was unintelligible. He calls it a contradictio in objecto,
yes,
I believe.
Yes.
And what that means is essentially when the subject and the predicate cancel each other out.
Yes.
You could say more about it, but apparently Aristotle was not a fan of this idea of an infinite sphere, but Aristotle did adhere to, from my understanding, I am not an expert on Aristotle's cosmology, but the little bit of reading up that I did on it is very, very fascinating. is, he believed in a spherical earth, but he also believed in these celestial spheres that themselves had entities behind them, whatever they were. I'm not exactly sure, but they had movers. So they had a set of stars in one sphere and planets in another sphere and the sun and the moon in another sphere. And you get upwards of like 55 different spheres, but there's different sub entities that are in control of these spheres, but they're finite, they're definite, they're not infinite, like Bruno and Copernicus and other individuals may have wanted. So I am in good company with Aristotle, who does find it to be a contradictory metaphor. And so this raises the question: we talk about metaphors being maps. The question is okay, some maps are going to be better than others. And the question it becomes, is this a flawed but serviceable metaphor? Is this a bad metaphor? Is this as good as we can do metaphor? Like, presumably there's a hierarchy of metaphors.
I think it depends entirely on where you're going. And my inclination when I think about Borges is to see that, or to believe that in some fundamental way, he, in his work, is celebrating and exploring paradox. And that of course Aristotle would not like an unintelligible sphere. My God, paradox, that runs contrary to order. And
Sure.
Borges, on the other hand, strikes me as a person who dances with things that are just beyond the tip of his tongue, and he does it in such a clever way that we want to dance with him.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to both points of view. Like, I'm not someone who is a Nazi for order in in the way that I carve up the world intellectually. Like, I understand that there are things that are going to ultimately transcend all our schematization and categorization of it. I suppose that for me personally, I think that for me personally, I'm just articulating this on the fly. If there are going to be things that shatter our concepts, I prefer to be those things that are given to us via revelation rather than our vivisection of physical reality, whatever physical reality is. Like, I very much believe in God. I believe, and interestingly, the thing that troubled me about this whole thing is that I find it interesting that Pascal himself became part of this tradition and talked about the fearful seer. And look, there is a lot more context to where Pascal said that, and he goes on and on and on, but he does talk about how this like ultimately makes us feel like we're castaways on a desert island. But interestingly enough, and I'm sure you know this little apocryphal story about Pascal's jacket. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I have read about it. I still haven't been able to find what he had sewn into the pocket.
Well, so apparently when he died, they found they took his jacket off the body and stuff like that, and that he had sewn this revelatory prayer into the back of his jacket to constantly remind him of the following. And I'm going to do a bad paraphrase of it, that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not the God of the philosophers. And what so happens, and I experienced this firsthand throughout my entire sojourn in philosophy, is that as my quest for truth led me more and more towards Christian sources, I personally tried to read Christianity into the philosophical texts that I was dealing with, and that always caused shipwreck. And it wasn't until much later on in my life where I realized that by and large, these things I'm trying to engage in the process of syncretization, and I need to be reminded of what Pascal had sewn into his jacket. When I'm doing philosophy, I'm not doing theology. And when I'm doing theology, I'm not necessarily doing philosophy, although I might use it as a tool that is subservient to revelation. But um, the thing I find so interesting is that if he had this revelatory experience where he could see that we're talking about different gods, why he would be so tormented by this idea of an infinite sphere. If he knew that, because he knows that the God of the Bible is, there's no reference to the sphericity of the God of the Bible. There's a lot of different references to the God of the Bible, like as being like anthropomorphic or a spirit or something like that, but not a sphere. That's not in there. So I'm surprised that Pascal was even troubled by this.
I wonder, and you're right, that's a great question. I wonder if we can go back to his theorem, in which started with a circle with 3 triangles scribed in a circle, and the thing that he realized before he'd even gotten out of his teens about the relationships of lines passing through triangles inscribed in circles, and that they.
Oh, you'll have to refresh my memory.
Hang on. I can find it.
Yeah, I don't know that off the top of my head.
It was his starting point. It was the thing that got him mentioned at first, and got him. He got Descartes' attention. And Descartes didn't.
Yeah, you mentioned something about that.
Didn't like him. Let's see. Hang on a second. I can't. I will find it.
Well.
Okay, but the point is that even as an adolescent, he created a mathematical theorem that bears his name. You're
not talking about Pascal's wager, are you?
No, not that we wager on the existence of God with our lives, but the idea that in a circle, if you transcribe or if you scribe 3 triangles inside the circle, boy, I will get it wrong, so I don't want to. Hang on, I'm going to look it up as we're speaking. Okay.
Sure, that's fine. I mean, I'll see what I can do here.
Oh well, wait a minute. While you're doing that, well, let's go to Pascal and Descartes, and the notion of dualism, and the idea that both of them recognized intuition and intellect as being sources of information, and both of them recognized intuition as being the superior one of the two. Now, I think that it might be fair to say that for both of them, intuition was a closer connection with revelation. I'm making that up.
I think you might be up more to speak. What's interesting, we've traded places. The philosopher has become a little bit more familiar with the literary, and you've become a little bit more familiar with the philosophical. So I would struggle with that. I don't have anything to say about intuition. I'd be struggling. I have to go back in my mind.
Okay.
Many file cabinets.
Okay, let's go back to Pascal's theorem. Pascal's theorem states that if 6 arbitrary points are chosen on a conic, and in his original case it was just a circle, and joined by line segments in any order to form a hexagon, then the 3 pairs of opposite sides of the hexagon meet at 3 points which lie on a straight line. That straight line is called the Pascal line of the hexagon. And the reason that I even bring that up is not just because, oh boy, here's Pascal's theorem, it is that if here was a guy who was working in circles, in two-dimensional or even conic sections as an adolescent, did he not then move to spherical objects? And did he not then try to make sense of those spherical objects in the same way that, and perhaps even transcendent sense, in the same way that he did of a circle? Again, I'm making stuff up.
Right. Well, I think it's an interesting question. If he was so fixated with geometry in his teens, and that geometry becomes a way, there is a whole practice of sacred geometry. This is something that's still taught,
well,
not in the universities, but in your neighborhood. This is something that's taught a great deal.
Have they moved much beyond Pythagoras?
I'm not one, so I can't I can't say how much they've progressed. But I think the interesting question is, let's just say that Pascal's foundation for the belief in God, and then his acceptance of Christ, is built upon a fixation with geometry at a young age. Like, for some reason, he's able to get from these triangles circumscribed. Is that the word? Within a circle. Okay. And then ultimately he's going to get there to a sphere, to ultimately to God being this infinite sphere. I think the question is, good for him, because I want everybody to, my own personal agenda is that I want everybody to know God in their own way. But I think the question is, it gets into a question of, are there erroneous paths to the absolute and to God? If this ultimately, which is a big question.
Well, if we're talking,
can you ultimately get there via the wrong way?
If we are talking about the infinite, how many ways are there to the infinite? Yeah, right.
from the testimonials that I have encountered, a different type of infinite, and this raises an interesting question about how many different types of infinities there are, because the infinity of God, I'm not tended to think about it in terms of a mathematical or a geometric infinity or a numerical root infinity.
Right.
In fact, to be honest, I have to say that the concept infinity associated with God is troubling with me, not because it brings to mind sphericity. It's that the only way that I can really get my mind around the infinity of God and have it being some sort of coherent thing, and maybe this is a limitation in my own mind, is that his love and his justice and his providence and things of these nature, which I don't know are subject to mathematical theorems, are infinite. But to say that God is somehow connected to mathematics, or is mathematics, or is a type of mathematical infinity, this is a struggle for me. Do you understand
absolutely.
why this is a struggle for me?
And I think we're back to Borges again, and happily so, and dancing with these notions of things that exist beyond the tips of our tongues. If we could describe it mathematically, so much the worse for us.
True. It would turn God into a formula.
I have read. I've been checking out things like multiplicity of dimensionality and that sort of thing, and geometricians working on a dodecahedral model for the universe, and one of them saying, isn't it wonderful that our universe works according to these principles? And I stop and think, boy, you've got it absolutely backwards. The universe doesn't work according to these principles. These principles are making a certain way of looking at the universe accessible. But don't think that's the conclusion. Don't think that's the end of it. And if I can go ahead and dance on here, I was talking with a pal yesterday who's very interested in cosmology, and I threw him that that line from way back when, and I don't. I know it was the Trismegistus line quoted by Delille. God is an intelligible sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. And I said, in our conversations, haven't you been saying to me that that's the current state of astrophysics, that they have gotten to the point that they agree mathematically that wherever you are standing in the universe, you are at the center of the universe, and the universe is expanding from that point in every direction at an equal speed. And he said, roughly speaking, yeah. And so rather than mathematics describing an infinite and mysterious, in my view, universe, we've gotten to the point where mathematics is trying to reconcile itself with the notion of an infinite and mysterious universe. Not that it will ever wrap itself around that, but that it will, and we'll head off into Barth here, that there will be a certain art in that metaphor, in that description.
Well, I would say it goes beyond art. I think it's religious. And what I would say, like, have you ever watched one of these supercuts on YouTube of all these leading theoretical physicists? They go, and rabbis, they'll go, hey, we're looking at quantum physics, we're looking at string theory, and guess what? We're coming up with, there being 10 dimensions or 26 dimensions. And guess what? This is in the Zohar. Isn't this interesting?
Yeah.
How did people 3,500 years ago, 4,000, whenever you want to, or I guess the Zohar is a little bit more of a recent text. I'm not some sort of.
It doesn't matter. The point's the same.
The point's the same. So forget what I'm saying about dating. It's predating modern physics. And what is happening is that mystical Judaism, or mysticism in general, is matching up with modern cosmology, and physicists are going, huh? And rabbis are going, we told you, it's all in the Kabbalah. So I mean, I'm sure in the books you're reading on dimensionality, I mean, is the Kabbalah coming up a lot?
No. These guys are strictly, they're following, they're keeping
they're
it
doing the quantum stuff.
They're keeping it between the lines, and that's fine with me. Because I don't need for them to venture outside their bubbles right now. But we're back again to that history of a handful of metaphors. And inclusive in that handful of metaphors may be current physics. Physics as metaphor.
Well, that's what I think is so great about this Borges piece is he's like, and this may upset some people, is what he's doing is he's going through this litany of metaphors. He mentions the Ptolemaic system. Mm-hmm. He mentions in passing the Aristotelian system. He's like, look, the Ptolemaic system held sway for 1,400 years, and then it was just discarded. Mm-hmm. And then we have Copernicus come along. Right. And even Copernicus's ideas, though they are the foundation, have been discarded. And we keep discarding metaphors like a snake shedding skin. And I think people who believe in this process is that ultimately, as we shed lesser metaphors, we're going to ultimately get to the perfect metaphor. We're going to get to the snake in its final form. And and that's an optimistic reading
That
of
is
that.
that is very optimistic.
Or you get to the idea of science is art. Now, I have no problem saying that.
Mm-hmm.
Or that science is art based in a mystical religious tradition. I have no problem saying that. But that I think that's a tough pill to swallow.
Sadly,
for a
I
lot
lost
of people.
you
So it
there
has
for
to
a
be
bit,
that these
Luke. I have a
metaphors are getting
poor
ever
connection, apparently.
closer to the absolute truth. And my internet got a little bad, so hopefully Charlie will come back here in a second. Reconnecting. And I don't know. I think that's ultimately one of the great divides of our time. I'm going to call Charlie back. We're both dealing with some.
Yeah, you back?
We're both dealing with some internet issues.
I'm
and
sorry.
Charlie's back. There he is.
Yeah, I have a poor connection. I'm very, very sorry because honestly, I believe we missed the climax of the entire conversation.
Well, I recorded it on my end, but just for your sake, it looks like we're presented with two different options. We're presented with a snake shedding different metaphorical skins to arrive at the absolute truth of reality, and this gives us hope in progress, or our metaphors are ultimately just art, just religious tradition that are going to be refashioned by the next generation. And to me, I tend towards that latter interpretation because that means like I can play with paradigms and try on new ways of seeing things. Like I can try on different types of eyeglasses to see which one I like. But for some individuals, there has to be a right answer. There has to be true teleology to our epistemological understanding of the world. It cannot be arbitrary. And I'm very okay. I've been doing a lot of work on the doors of perception and Aldous Huxley and Blake, and essentially transcending all these imprisoning metaphors so that we can bask in that which cannot be linguistically grasped, breaking on through to the other side, as Jim Morrison once said. Right?
Yeah, and I'm with you. If we have to choose one thing or another, and I question the notion of having to choose one thing or another, because I think that in itself is that reduces our choices. But if we have to,
there are more options.
If we had to choose between one and the other, I'm with the second one. Absolutely, I don't want to be restrained by the metaphorical onion. I don't want to have to view my metaphors as I shed them as skins being shed by a snake, or as layers being peeled off an onion. I'd rather have freedom to adapt my metaphors as
right.
new evidence, whatever that evidence may be, suggests.
I lost you. Yeah, I lost you there for a second, but I think you probably said something really profound.
No, it was just given two choices, I'd rather take choice 3. I'd rather be able to choose my metaphors, acknowledging that those metaphors are inherently weakened by language. I would rather choose my metaphors based on new evidence, whatever the new evidence is.
Well, this raises an interesting question about the options that are laid out before us. Now, this particular essay, if that's what this is, I don't even know what do you call Borges's pieces?
Well, he called it a note. Actually, I did a little work on that, and Borges is responsible for, hang on, I'll find it. He arguably invented the hypertext novel, in which the reader chooses links to move from one node of text to the next, and in this fashion arranges a story from a deeper pool of potential stories. And I think we've got that sort of thing going on here, simply because it's Borges, not because it's fiction or nonfiction, that he has established, and we have explored a mess of nodes that lead us in a whole variety of different directions.
They certainly do. I'm so glad that you brought that up. He's like a pre-internet hypertext.
Yeah.
So I like that a lot. So the question I have here with these different options about how we understand metaphor, if we adopt this ever refined infinite sphere model, there's a sort of existential ennui that Pascal puts his finger on, that it makes us feel like we're these castaways on this desert island. Now, is there a different type of existential ennui?
Luke, you're flickering in and out on me. I am so sorry. Do it again, please.
No problem. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to call you via just regular telephone so we have a better connection. I'm going to call you right back, okay?
Do it.
Okay. Just calling Charlie back. Thank you, everyone who's listening. Sorry for our technical issues.
Okay, got it.
Hey, I think we won't have any more internet problems because
I screwed up. I'm sorry. Please continue.
No, you're great. You're great. So I think the question ultimately becomes, if we're going to hold on to this path of ever refined spherical metaphor that gets improved little by little over generation, and the ennui that is besetting ourselves, is thinking about ourselves as being in no particular place, no particular time, that our lives do not matter, that ultimately we're just dust in the wind, right? Isn't that the Kansas song?
It is.
Was it Kansas? So there's that sense of dread. But I think the reason why people would rather have that sense of dread than to think about all of our metaphors as being interchangeable, disposable, potentially arbitrary, updatable, is that then we have these infinite ways of seeing the world. And for many people, that's you seem okay with, I guess the question is, how do we stay grounded if all our metaphors and paradigms are provisional, if they can be supplanted by new evidence? Now, for me, we look at this differently, or last time we talked, but for me, like, I have like a biblical HQ that I can retreat to, right? Like, so if I go and lose a battle, right, I can go back to the Bible and nurse my wounds and rethink it or something like that, right? I've got this fortress that I can retreat to of my understanding. But if I didn't have that, maybe I would be one of these individuals that would be obsessed with the absolutizing of whatever in vogue metaphor is dominating our understanding of the universe at the moment.
Yes.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, yes. And that's absolutely true. Absolute being a relative term, because it came out of my mouth.
Right.
I, when confronted with my finitude, appeal to a higher power that I cannot name, I cannot understand, that I can only know. And it exists in, around, it permeates for me all things and transcends all things. And our conversation is a very, very rough injustice to it, that it doesn't care about, because it is not affected by my trivia. And that if I am able to quiet my my monkeys, my monkey mind, my false self, my ego, whatever you care to call it. And again, all of those things that I call it are metaphors based in some other system, which is itself a metaphorical attempt to describe, to map what is. But if I am able to quiet that, I can find on my better days that which permeates and transcends.
So you have your own fortress of understanding. So like
I have.
even if right. So it's an interesting thing because I don't think I've ever really put words to it. But if I see information about, oh, we've got this new discovery about muons at a particle collider, and we've got this new discovery about gases in the universe, or that are rewriting everything that we understand about cosmology, or we
and bless their
we found
hearts.
a new
and so hit for the cycle for the Red Sox yesterday. Isn't it all wonderful?
Well, that's I care. But see this. So this engenders within me the perspective of being invested in those discoveries as much as about who batted third for the Red Sox in the first inning yesterday.
Right.
But people would call that anti-intellectual, anti-scientific, troglodyte perspective.
Why? Why would they call it that? Because it's not conventional. It's not traditional.
Because I think there's a lot of truth to the expression "nature abhors a vacuum," and so if you're going to tear down all religion or all spirituality and become a materialist, you're going to, as much as you say that you don't believe in a higher power or God or Christ or Buddha or Muhammad or whatever else, the way that humans are so constructed is that they're going to take that religious impulse and infinitize and absolutize whatever it attaches to.
Yeah.
So for some individuals, it's going to be this monolithic understanding of science. Some people, it's going to be this monolithic understanding of romantic love. For some individuals, it's going to be this understanding of music and art, that this is going to become a religion for them, even if they don't understand that it's a religion. And so when someone like myself were to say, metaphors are discarded like this, like the skins of a snake, and that everything is provisional, that turns me into a heretic.
Yes.
Because they're operating from a position of religious totalitarianism in a way.
Yes.
And if they could, I think they would want to burn me at the stake. And then we have this whole
and then we get back to good old what's his name, who you brought up a while back. What was that guy's? What was that cat?
Oh, how many?
Huh?
How many? I mean, how many? The story of religion is replete with individuals who were burnt at the stake, both scientists and reformers.
Nah, but you brought up one earlier on, and I can't remember his name. Just a very obscure name.
Bruno Campanella.
Yeah. He got torched.
Was it Campanella that got torched, or was it Bruno?
Oh no, I'm sorry, it's Bruno. Bruno
got torched.
Yeah. And so you have personalized something that is part of our universal history. Let's go to the second paragraph of Borges' notes, in which he talks about Xenophanes, who wearied of the Homeric verses and lashed out at the poets who attributed anthropomorphic traits to the gods, and he offered the Greeks a single god, a god who was an eternal sphere. Now, what do you suppose Aristophanes went through in order to get that one sentence in Borges' essay?
You mean Xenophanes?
Xenophanes. I'm sorry. What do you suppose
yeah.
Xenophanes went through? What was his life like when he had discarded the anthropomorphic and replaced it with the geometric? What was he responding to a cultural change in Greece? Was he provoking a cultural change? Was he doing a little bit of both?
I don't know enough about the biography of Xenophanes, but I know what happened when Socrates did this. and it right.
We
and
still got the Hemlock
that,
Society to this day.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it ultimately culminated in the I guess the forced suicide of Socrates. Because ultimately, he was denying a religious institution. And I don't know. Do you know what happened to Xenophanes? Did he
I have no
experience
idea.
a similar sort?
I have no idea.
I don't know if he was put to death for this, but I think I can imagine that he encountered serious backlash. I imagine it being.
He probably lost gigs, at very least.
Yeah. I have to look into it. I don't know. I don't know.
But I guess my point is that as you personalize your position in this universal history, you are nonetheless part of a long line of heretics, and that there is a certain, or could be a certain, pride in being a certain kind of heretic. To go back to your early comment about are there wrong ways of reaching the infinite?
Yeah. I mean, I think this raises an interesting question about what is a heretic. I mean, there's a perceived hereticism, and then there is actual hereticism.
Well,
maybe it's all maybe it's all perceived hereticism.
We know that Pascal's sister was involved with a heretic organization, the Jansenists, and that he was deeply, well, not deeply involved with them, but he went there a lot to visit her, as did Montaigne. But and what was their heresy about?
You're gonna have to refresh my memory.
Here we go. I am there. I'd be
speculating.
The heresy of Jansenism, as stated by subsequent Roman Catholic doctrine, lay in denying the role of free will in the acceptance and use of grace. Jansenism asserts that God's role in the infusion of grace cannot be resisted and does not require human assent. It's a fine point, but it sure is an interesting one.
It'd be interesting to understand the differences between Jansenism and Calvinism. Personally, I never thought it would ever happen, but at 41 years of age, I've never been so sympathetic to the concept of predestination. And I think it goes back to this idea of myself being a heretic. I didn't ask to be one. I don't want to be one. Like my life was really cool. I had a lot going for me.
But heresy is simply a label applied by somebody you've pissed off.
I know, but I'm just saying personally, many of the conclusions that I've come to seem irresistible. They seem to be things that I am not capable of denying. So
are you capable of proving them?
I believe I can.
Okay.
But what is prove?
Right. And then it's up to somebody else to accept them.
Right. I mean, I feel like there are a few things that I feel that I could prove at the Supreme Court. Would that be satisfactory for the world population?
Well, it depends on the composition of the court.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, all that really matters is that I can prove it to myself. I mean,
yes.
Because if I'm
Yes.
waiting on other individuals to be like, hey, you know what? This kid's on to something. Like I'm going to be waiting a long time. And so are these other individuals. If uh, uh, Ptolemy or Bruno or Copernicus or whatever was waiting for the world to be like, hey, yeah, you're right about that. Like they never would have published their works.
Right. Yeah.
You know, if we have to have universal 100% compliance, there would never be any innovation whatsoever.
If we have to have universal compliance, there is not going to be anything worthwhile ever stated.
Right.
You know, because it's got to push the boundaries. And that was also something that I was reading about these guys, but that'll wait for another time. So anyway.
Sure. Well, maybe, we could talk forever. And I mean, if you haven't read this piece, this what are we calling this again? Some kind of hypertext?
He's the father of hypertext.
Father of hypertext.
Yes.
I highly encourage everyone to go through it with a fine tooth comb. I mean, one of the great discoveries that I made in here. Did you have a chance to look this up? John Donne's elegy, The Anatomy of the World.
I have not.
Are you familiar with it?
No.
Oh, that was one of the great Easter eggs in this. There are many, many, many more.
Oh, wait. I'm sorry. I got to toss in. I finally found the Pascal sentence, because I think it has bearing on what you were talking about. Pascal looked into the issue of discovering truths, arguing that the ideal of such a method would be to found all propositions on already established truths. At the same time, however, he claimed that this was impossible because such established truths would require other truths to back them up. First principles, therefore, cannot be reached.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. There's, and the thing that I want to communicate to people is, even when you're doing philosophy and physics and mathematics and all these things, you think that these things are grounded and proved somewhere. And the thing I want to communicate is, and I think the thing that Borges has communicated is that they are postulated and then passed down and given and then intellectualized as time goes on.
Yes.
And Xenophanes is like, yeah, I don't like Homer, so we're going to go with this eternal sphere thing.
Yeah.
Now I'm not familiar with the works of Xenophanes. Maybe he proved it. Plato, with his Platonic solids and all this stuff in the Timaeus, he also comes to the conclusion that, that the most perfect geometric figure is a sphere.
And therefore, it must be God.
Yeah. And therefore, and I'm looking at this now. I haven't looked at the Timaeus in a long time, and I'm going to have to do this research justice. But why a sphere? Like, spheres are cool. I love playing basketball. I love playing basketball, and it's a great game. But like, you know what figures are more enticing to me? Like the figure of a beautiful woman. Like, to me, that's more perfect than a sphere.
Yeah, but that's just bilateral symmetry, man. That is not.
No, I think it's much more. This gets into questions of anthropomorphism as well.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to say here, whether it's a dodecahedron, a isohedron, whatever the different Platonic solids are, it seems to me like the reasoning is not incredibly sound for why a sphere would be like God or the universe, or why it needs to be worshipped in some way. I mean, is there a dodecahedron religion? Is there a pyramidal religion?
And you have gone back to our starting point in this conversation regarding the limits of metaphor and the idea that a sphere as metaphor is it misses something. It misses something fundamental about what we look for in in an infinite, in that fortress, if you will, in that infinite being, in that infinite knowing. Sphere just doesn't quite do it metaphorically, for me anyway.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine for me that, I mean, maybe I just have a limited imagination. But this raises an interesting question about if we're getting these things from our imagination, you know, if all these things are derived from abstraction, um, you know, I I I don't mean to be the Bible thumper here, but if you just do like a keyword search in the Bible for imagination, you know, we in our culture, we have like, John Lennon's Imagine or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory Imagination, imagination is such a celebrated thing within our culture. But if you do a keyword search in the Bible, that's not what it says. Now, that might not matter to you or more people who are not coming from a biblical tradition, but almost every reference of the imagination in the Bible is that it does nothing but lead men to destruction. There's no celebration of imagination. Now, maybe I just turned a bunch of people off to Christianity.
I don't worry so much about that as I worry about the limitations of the text and the translation. And I wonder if you're talking Old Testament, if you went back to Aramaic, if you'd get the same thing.
I was looking into, I was looking into the presence of animals in the Bible. And I came up across a translation issue. I was looking for beetles in the Bible, and there's only one reference of beetles, but the word can it's almost interchangeable with the word locust. So we with our phylogenetic classification system, our metaphor, our science today, right, says that beetles are not locusts, right?
Right.
But they didn't have that then. So the words that they're using are different. And so a plague of locusts or a plague of beetles we might have to set aside our modern understanding to really understand what they're talking about about locusts.
And it may depend on which monk it was who was doing the translation that day.
Right. But I do think it's interesting that beetles and locusts are interchanged, and the locusts were sent as a plague.
Yes.
Right upon Pharaoh, and I find it interesting that we had a beetle invasion of our own, but perhaps I'm.
And there's the small question of spelling and numbers, but impact certainly.
Yeah. So I wonder if there's this last line of the piece. It may be that universal history is the history of the different intonations given a handful of metaphors. So I think we've effectively addressed how there can be these different intonations and how that metaphor can evolve over time. But what's interesting that I think in this last line is that Borges seems to intimate that there's only a handful of metaphors that are driving universal history. It's not like he's saying there's an unlimited number of them. There's a handful. And I don't know how many a handful is. 6?
I'm not sure that he's talking about those metaphors as drivers at all, but as maps. If we could look at it as, it may be that universal history is the history of the different intonations. Let us look at, is it possible that he is saying to us that we can learn a lot about our changes as humanity as we look at the way this particular metaphor, the sphere, has changed over for the purposes of his note, the course of Western civilization. Not that it drove anything, but that its changes reflect changes in the social contract that forms the foundation for language, in the cultures that shaped the social contracts.
No, it changes everything. I mean, you don't if you don't have the infinite eternal sphere. I mean, let's say you wipe the slate clean and you no longer have that. What do you have?
Well, it depends. If you are a Tibetan Buddhist, you have a great number of gods with a lot of different territory. I think he is speaking to us from the standpoint of the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, and there are other traditions that might approach this whole thing differently.
Totally. I guess the question is, if this should go away, it was interesting. It was interesting. Popular Science ran an article. To be honest, I only retweeted it. I didn't read the entire article, but the headline was, "What would happen if the moon disappeared?" That was.
I don't think you need to read much farther than just the headline for that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And presumably it was dealing with. Presumably it was dealing from a mechanistic perspective, and all the the Earth's tilt and blah 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 blah. But let's say this infinite sphere we just wake up one day and it was gone.
Wait a minute. It was gone, or the whole history from Xenophanes through Pascal through Borges writing about it was gone.
It was eradicated from our paradigms for carving up the world.
Okay.
I mean, obviously it would still exist within history books and things like that, but we're just like done with it. Like we put it in the trash file of our computer. The question is, would individuals be ready to return to Eastern traditions like Tibetan Buddhism, to return to things that we would find to be too primitive, or some would find to be too primitive, or would this be chaos? I mean, what would be the implications if that was just gone?
I don't understand. I don't quite grasp the goneness that you are talking about.
So, for me personally, I do not believe in an infinite sphere. Okay. This metaphor is in my trash of the computer.
Okay, but it nonetheless exists. You haven't discarded the trash. It is part of your internal, not necessarily your internal dialogue, although I bet it is, but it's in that library. And are you saying that it would continue, it would remain in your library, you just wouldn't access it any longer, or would it just be plain erased? Not just from your library, but from everybody's library.
Well, you know what? I have to keep it on file because if I didn't have it on file, I wouldn't be able to talk about this piece, right?
Right.
And it's like, I never believed in Santa Claus. Okay. Never as a child.
Okay. Now we're in trouble. We were good with heresy up until this, but now you've stepped over the line, buddy.
I've gone too far. So I never even absorbed Santa Claus. It was always in the trash folder. But because I
disagree.
I interact with, I still have to interact with children who are, believe in this concept. So I'm like, oh yeah, like you better be good for Santa. Like I have to kind of have access to it every once in a while. I'm like, how does this Santa story go? Oh, he's got reindeer and he's at the North Pole. And if you're good, you get presents. And if you're bad, you get coal. So I guess it's in my library because I have to, but I think I could completely eradicate it if I didn't have to interact with children that believed in it. It would be permanently erased.
See, I challenge that.
You think I'd, yeah.
I think that it is that these things are indelible elements of our personal histories, and even no longer referring to them doesn't make them no longer exist.
Yeah, they still rattle around in there.
Right.
I don't, it's a weird experience for me is, and Charlie's known me since I was 14 or 15 years old. So it was a big deal. So Charlie's one of my most long-standing mentors, friends. Actually, for
I'm
those
honored.
who are curious,
Thank you.
You turned me into this.
Yeah, it's all my fault.
It is all your fault. Yeah. Had our paths never crossed, I would be selling insurance. I'd have a nice Stepford wife and all of that. But you just had to come along.
Would you call her a Stepford wife? No.
No. But what I'm trying to say is you really opened to the Pandora's box. So, I'm not responsible for the things that I said. You did this to me.
Yeah.
But a strange development in my own life for the past 5 or 6 years, Charlie and not only did we bond over intellectual matters, but Charlie and I bonded over musical matters because my life was driven by music for 20 some years. And Charlie still makes music and quite good music.
Thank you.
But I do not listen to music at all anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like the only music I can listen to now, and it's not because I hate music or something like that. It just doesn't do it for me anymore. The only music that I can really listen to is like slowed down ambient Aphex Twin when I'm writing. Mm-hmm. And even then it's only a couple pieces like Stone and Focus, April 14th, and like Rhubarb. Anything with a beat just throws me off.
Wow, Brian Eno is a bridge too far for you, huh?
Brian Eno, I'm bored of Brian Eno. For some reason, maybe I listen to I think I listened to music for airports and the stuff that he did for the Apollo program too much when I was doing my dissertation. But so I used to have like this. So it's interesting. I had this encyclopedic knowledge of music. I actually had a better grasp of music than I did philosophy because I was more animated about it. I was more excited about it. And I moved all that to the trash bin. And I think it's completely erased. But I was in a situation this past weekend where I couldn't listen to a book, which I'm constantly either reading a book, inhaling a book, audibly, whatever I'm doing. And so I turned on the radio and the Counting Crows song, Mr. Jones, came on. Now I haven't heard this song in 6+ years. And I'm thinking, and it immediately came back.
Right.
It immediately came back and Technicolor, totally vivid. The music video was present. Everything was still there. So it's still imprinted on me, but I have to say, I listened to this song. This song is so deranged. I used to think of that as like, oh, this like pap, like simple song. The whole song disgusted me because the whole song is about wanting to be an idol. The whole song is about needing the love and adulation of the masses. I want to see myself on the TV staring back at me. And this innocent little song to me seems very dangerous, but that's a whole other subject. But I thought it was in my computer trash and it had been completely wiped and erased, but it's still there. So you're right. These things, Santa, Infinite Spheres, Counting Crows, they're all still there.
And Luke, I think that it is important that they still be there. Not that you embrace them, but that these things are part of the fullness of you. And again, we go back to somebody's idea of a sphere. You know, you are a perfect sphere, even though it may not be geometric in the sense that we close our eyes and see the abstract geometric sphere. But your life is the perfect expression of itself. And I think that infinity, our higher power, whatever, is the perfect expression of itself and is in some way beyond description, beyond beyond metaphor, as you are beyond metaphor, and unique.
Well, there's a lot of. I appreciate you saying that. That's very kind because it's very easy to render uh, individuals as caricatures. And, we spoke earlier about certain metaphors before we got started recording. There's this story that Kierkegaard tells about a fire that broke out in a theater, and the clown in the performance comes out to warn everybody that there's a fire in a theater. And because people see him so one-dimensionally as the clown, they ignore the warning and just laugh at him because they've been conditioned to laugh, and they can't heed the warning of doom.
Right.
And I think that's part of the problem that we have with this. Is really more of a meditation on internet culture, perhaps, like, is our inability to see people for what they really are, which is things that transcend caricatures. That's things that transcend well-worn tropes or memes, or geometrically reducible spheres. That not just Luke is something indescribable and beyond the sphere, but that every single individual is beyond the sphere. And I think we've lost that reverence for the individual, and and that's something that I would like to see come back. I feel because of so much division, financial division, political division, racial division, cosmological division, it's becoming increasingly difficult to see the beyondness of people.
Well, yeah,
And I want to thank you because you're one of the few people that has retained that ability, at least in relation to me.
Well, I decided a number of years ago that we had moved in, and this is not an original thought with me. I think I read that someone else called this the age of ultra, the age in which we have been bombarded by so much that we have relinquished our abilities to make decisions and distinctions, and instead rely on other or individuals, organizations, corporations that have been called persons now, to not only to package this information so that it is manageable to us, but to tell us how we should feel about the packaging of that information. And I fear that we have over applied that into all of our lives, that we apply those little, as you say, the tropes, the memes, to situations and circumstances in which they don't apply. But we are, just as with you and Santa Claus, Santa Claus is always there, whether you think about him or not. You see a white beard and a red hat, you're gonna think that thing and then reject it, perhaps. And I fear that many of us have been conditioned, probably all of us have been conditioned to not necessarily either to accept or decline, but to exist in a world of tropes and memes that we do not consciously acknowledge, nor do we control. And again, we get back to Jansenism.
We do. And one has to wonder if one has to wonder if I'm skittish to even say it, but I think a question we need to ask ourselves is if this is intentional in some way, if perhaps there uh, perhaps might be some force, let's say, that is interested in molding the minds of men so that they can predestinate and in that way become a facsimile of God. And perhaps that might be what memes and tropes and fragmented culture is about.
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't agree with you, but that's just because I come from a different realization of an expression of my relationship with a higher power. But I can see how one might look at things as or certain things as evil.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I believe in this either. I'm just thinking on the fly and speculating and saying, you know what, maybe that's why the internet is rolled out. But even though I'm speculating, I'm making assumption that that the internet is not an organic emergence from technology.
Not yet, anyway. Ha ha ha.
Yeah, that is. I'm assuming that it is something disclosed rather than incidentally emergent. So I feel like a lot of people can read between the lines here. So.
But Luke, just as with other heretic concerns that you may have, whether or not this concern turns out to be founded or well-founded is less relevant than whether or not the question continues to be asked. And my real fear would be when we stopped asking the question. Okay?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to a friend last night, and there were two things that like my elementary school principal impressed upon me, and I like actually believed in. And one of them was that there were no stupid questions, and that if all of my friends jumped off of a cliff, would I do it as well? And I feel like maybe like a lot of people were absent that day of school. You know,
why? Because they've all jumped off cliffs, or okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I think there are certain questions you can't ask. Okay, I think there are questions that are wrong think, and I think, I think there are cliffs that we get hazardously close to, and I don't need to go into what I think those things are, but I'm just a big believer in what my elementary school principal used to tell me at assemblies, and that was that there are no stupid questions, and that I don't have to jump off a cliff if I don't want to.
Okay,
that's it.
Good thing. Because you're asking you're asking good questions, and you're still here. I haven't had to pull you back from that like Beetle Bailey, where Sarge is hanging by a little tree limb off of a cliff, and Beetle has to rescue him. I haven't found you in that situation.
No, I just enjoy learning. Just that's about all I really want to do.
Good.
Reading and writing.
Good.
So, all right, we could talk forever. This is a longer one. I usually try to keep about an hour.
I hope you edit the out of this thing, quite honestly.
No. Well, I might have to edit that word out, but in general, I think I'll keep the whole thing. And I appreciate you joining us so much. And and I'd love to do this again if you have the time and if you found
if
it to be an enjoyable experience.
if we have more restraint next time. But there's something about liberal conversations that just seem, and Borges is a natural for that sort of thing. Just one path after another, heading who knows where, leading us back to some familiar nexus, but then on to something else. And it's great fun. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah. I don't think Borges would want to précis on this. I think if Borges were here, I don't know him all that well, but I think when I hit stop record, there would be applause if you were here in the room.
So thank goodness you guys are done. That kind of applause?
No, I think this to be honest, I think it's precisely what Borges would want is the liberal conversation.
Yeah.
I think he wants this exploration, even if it means going down certain dead ends. These are his labyrinths.
Absolutely.
He wants us to fight our way. He wants to sit back. It's like Jack in The Shining, where he's looking at the labyrinth and he's the Minotaur. He wants to see people come to him and try to escape. And there's a certain joy in that, or how Daedalus built the labyrinth for King Minos. Like, there's a certain joy to be able to see people struggle out of this thing that you've created.
Well, I think, have you read Borges' Asterion 2?
I have read it. I have not thought about it as much as I thought about this.
Speaking of the Minotaur.
Yeah, it is this book that I'm putting together, the metaphor of of Ariadne, Theseus, the metaphor, the magical yarn. It will be one of the predominating metaphors in this book that I put together. What I found is that this metaphor pretty much is a recurrent part of our cultural code, but that's another conversation.
Ariadne is one of my heroes throughout all of time. So mistreated, so forgotten, neglected, and Mama had her revenge, didn't she?
Well, to be honest, I have trained my attention more to Theseus.
Okay.
And from what I understand, there are multiple tellings of the Ariadne story.
Yes.
And so I don't know them all. So I need to make myself familiar with all the different permutations of the
I'm stuck
relationship between.
I am stuck on the one where he forgot to come back for her, and she cried out to Mnemosyne, and Mnemosyne led Theseus to forget to put up the white flag, and so his dad jumped off the cliff.
Yeah.
So,
Anyway, whose version is that?
Beats me. Mine.
Yours. It could be.
Yeah.
Borges has his, so for those of you who don't know, the House of Asterion, it's written from the perspective of the Minotaur, which is very interesting.
Yes.
All right, Charlie, let's bring this one to a close, and maybe if I can interest you, we can do House of Asterion next time.
Thank you for indulging me so much. I really appreciate it.
No. I guess this killing multiple birds with one stone gives me the opportunity to talk to you.
Yeah.
All right.
Take good care.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Luke.
And thank you, everyone else.
Bye-bye.
Bye.